So, right before I go, because I always forget to do this, my name is Deontez Wibley. And I need you all to like, comment, and subscribe. So before I go into the depth of my own particular journey and the history of how HIV and the church has been related, I want to talk a little bit about what HIV is. So HIV is the human immunodeficiency virus. It is a virus that attacks what are known as immune cells, and the issue with attacking our immune cells is that we need those cells to really be able to fight off what are known as pathogens. So pathogens are anything that really comes into the body that the body needs to reject because it's not a part of the body. We encounter these all the time, and so our immune system does an amazing job at keeping our bodies healthy and safe. And what makes HIV very devastating is that it attacks those cells. It is known as an autoimmune disease. It really attacks those cells that keep us healthy, keep us thriving, and keep us whole. And so the good thing is there's been so much advancements within society and within medicine to where HIV now is a very livable disease when people are able to live with HIV. There are people who were diagnosed in the early 80s who are still living and thriving with HIV today. And so that's a little bit about the medicine behind HIV. But what we know is that HIV is not just solely a medical issue. There is so much documented research and history to show how HIV is truly not just a public health crisis, but it is also a crisis of faith. It is also a crisis of families, and also a crisis of just the community that we live in. And how we address and respond to HIV is very significant because it is going to inform how we address and really take serious a lot of different public health subjects that surround our community. So let's do a little walk down memory and a walk down history real quick. So I'm going to read this very telling story of a church in Boston, Massachusetts, and how it responded to HIV. The year is 1987. On a February morning in 1987, a handful of conservative Protestants stood outside the Unitarian Universalist Church in Amherst, Massachusetts. As driving winds and freezing rains battered them all, they began to recite the rosary. Some carried signs reading, "A wolf's in sheep's clothing," and "Promotion of condoms will procure the wrath of God." They assembled outside the church that Sunday morning to protest the Reverend Carl Fatiker, who planned to hand out condoms during a sermon about HIV. The married father of 4 felt moved to discuss the epidemic in his church after learning that a fellow minister had contracted HIV. He hoped this largely symbolic act of passing out condoms would draw attention to the need for the church and for society to confront the quickened pace of the disease, which was surging through the communities of gay men and drug users, which by the late 1980s was headed towards white, middle-class, heterosexual households as well. Here we are in 1987. We are in the Reagan administration. We are in a particular sea change, in a particular climate where the rise of conservative evangelicalism is starting to take its ground. It is moving very quickly throughout our political system and very quickly throughout our country. And HIV becomes one of the beginning issues that they are able to advance what they know as the moral awakening of America. And this particular pastor at this Unitarian Universalist church is moving against that particular moral climate. He is also taking a stance, and his stance is the best way to confront HIV as he knew it at the time was, one, to encourage abstinence, because the research at the time just really was pushing people to remain abstinent and to not use drugs. But if you are having sex, because he was willing to confront the realities of the world that he lived in, he said use a condom, which completely went against a lot of what many of those within the moral movements of the conservative evangelical church was trying to preach. Unfortunately, Reverend Thaddeker was not able to create such a mass movement that really stood on his side of this argument, because we find that many years later, at the beginning of the 21st century, the conservative evangelical movement is dominating the world's and the nation's conversation about HIV. One of the pinnacle figures to really shape this conversation is a minister known as Rick Warren. Let's go back into this book, which is an excellent book, mind you. I must recommend. It's called After the Wrath of God. So I have this library not just for show. I really do read my books, and I have excellent book recommendations. And so I want to read a paragraph that really helps to capture and show how the conservative evangelical movement really took the reins and really captured the narrative of the church and HIV. While evangelicals have been involved in fighting AIDS since the early 1980s, their work received little national attention into the early 21st century, when prominent leaders like Rick Warren made the crisis a key priority. Author of the best-selling Guide to Christian Living, The Purpose-Driven Life, Warren founded Saddleback Church in 1980. And it has since grown into one of the largest congregations in the United States. Along with his wife Kay, he has championed a biblically based approach to AIDS work, one that places an evangelical notion of sexual morality at its center. That moral proposition includes abstinence from marriage and fidelity within a monogamous union. Since the early 2000s, this approach to HIV prevention has gained prominence not only within the voluntary sector of AIDS relief, but also at the level of national policy, evidenced by the success of evangelical lobbying for abstinence-only sex education. Let me explain what's going on here. Many people want to respond to HIV. And whereas we would expect that if there is a disease, that the response could best come from public health professionals and doctors, the church also figures that we need to respond too. And there's a particular reason why the church feels the need to respond to HIV. A part of the transmission of HIV is the exchange of body fluids, particularly blood, semen, vaginal, and anal fluids. And so these exchange of body fluids particularly happen within two primary modes. When we're talking about blood, we're often talking about the exchange of blood by way of needles, oftentimes through drug use. When we're talking about semen and vaginal fluids, we're absolutely talking about sex. So if we're talking about drugs and if we're talking about sex, the church feels like they have a need to respond, particularly a need to respond in a way that pushes towards their particular ethic around sexual morality. For the church, medicine is not the only answer towards addressing HIV. Morality is the answer towards addressing HIV. And how people don't get HIV, just live up to our moral standards. We know abstinence is the 100% way to avoid HIV, so that just gives us, particularly the conservative evangelical movement, the strong argument to make that we have the answer, because we've been preaching abstinence forever. So clearly, if we've been preaching abstinence forever, and abstinence is the 100% way to stop HIV, and HIV is devastating people, we must be right. And so Rick Warren is really pushing this abstinence-only model towards how we address HIV. And churches take along that particular model, and it is like a match in a forest. It becomes the dominant way that churches respond to HIV through a particular lens of morality. Now, unfortunately, it's not just about sex and it's not just about drug use, because this moral lens takes its way over into talking about not just what people do in the bedroom, but how people are living their lives. It becomes a way to really marginalize people who are gay. It becomes a way of marginalizing people who do sex work. It becomes a way of marginalizing people who do drugs. And so what happens is we now move not just from talking about sex and morality, but we really move to a way in which we talk about people, and particularly a way in which we do that is grounded in stigma. Stigma matters here because there has been a lot of research to show that when we address that, because of stigma exacerbates and really is the reason why HIV becomes the epidemic that it is. And it is the church that is squarely responsible, a particular reading of the church grounded within conservative evangelicalism, that expands this particular stigma notion. I am someone that likes to ground all of what I do within research. So I have an article, and particularly some research by this scholar, Pamela Foster, at the University of Alabama, to really reference, to drive home this point about how the morality movement of the evangelical church led to the exacerbation of HIV within our communities. Those questions drove her research at the University of Alabama, where she led a study from 2012 to 2016 that involved 12 black churches in rural Alabama. She and her team developed a faith-based anti-stigma course built on curriculums used by the Christian Council of Ghana, one of the few such curriculums available in the NAACP. The 8-hour course, conducted by a team member and a pastor or the wife of a senior pastor, taught facts about HIV, but also discussed the negative effects of stigma and encouraged efforts to fight it. 4 congregations took the course, while 8 other congregations served as control groups. 4 took a different course focused only on HIV facts, while 4 others had brochures on HIV placed in their church's lobby. Compared with controls, the congregations that took the anti-stigma course had greatly reduced their negative opinions of HIV studies. The study is one of the growing number that suggests that black churches can reduce the HIV epidemic's effects on black Americans. Among researchers who study behavior associated with HIV transmission, this has contributed to stigma directed at HIV, homosexuality, or both. Studies have shown that stigma, whether real or perceived, damages the health of people living with HIV. They conceal their HIV status, so they skip taking their medicine when it can't be done in secret. It also causes others to avoid HIV testing, which means they can unknowingly transmit the virus. Stigma contributes to social isolation and poor mental health, risk factors for substance abuse, and healthcare avoidance, factors that themselves can increase HIV transmission. What we see from the research is that this particular moral response, grounded by these particular sexual ethics that says this is the way that you should be living, and if you aren't living, then you're outside of what is considered to be the good standard for society, and if you're outside of what's considered the good standard for society, you are a bad person, you don't belong in this community, and you are wrong, dirty, and filthy, and HIV is the consequence of you not living according to the standard and ethic that we have. That stigma-grounded response has devastated not only Black America, but has devastated all of our responses to HIV. But what we also find in the research is that when we address stigma, we have a way of successfully addressing HIV and moving us towards a world where HIV no longer exists. Let's fast forward. So the research that we found from Dr. Foster at the University of Alabama concluded in 2016. And that's a pretty significant year for me because in 2016, I was invited to the Young Black Gay Leadership Institute. And while I was there, I led a talk on HIV. And I led this talk on HIV not just as a public health professional, but as a Christian, as a progressive-minded Christian who understands that the church should be responding. Because we see the research that when the church responds well, the results are amazing. And I offered a particular reflection on a very famous passage of scripture to really move us in a direction of thinking, how should the church respond? Particularly, how should the church respond in a way that is positive, in a way that is helpful, and in a way that is healthy? What would Jesus say? Well, let me read the passage of scripture that I really reflected on, that really spoke to me and offered some very positive ways of thinking about this entire issue. So in Luke, the 8th chapter, there's a famous story known as the woman with the issue of blood. And Jesus is passing through the crowds, and this woman with the issue of blood touches the hem of Jesus' garments. Let's listen to what the scripture says, and I'm going to start at Luke, the 8th chapter, verse 43. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and though she had spent all that she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind him and touched the fringes of his clothes, or like we say in the good church, the hem of his garments, and immediately her hemorrhages stopped. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you are pressing up on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power has gone out of me." When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling and falling before him. She declared in the presence of all the people why she touched him. So everyone is looking at this because Jesus is like, someone touched me. She's like, look, I done spent all I had. It's been 12 years. I'm bleeding. And understand something here. When a woman is on her menstrual cycle within this particular area of time, she is ostracized from society. She can't go to the temple. She shouldn't be able to leave her house. Like, she is considered untouchable. Like the act of menstruating, and she is dealing with this hemorrhaging for years, she should be relegated to the outskirts of society. She is a woman dealing with stigma because of a health issue that she has, and she should not be touching anyone, and no one is really down to touch her. Yet she violates all those rules and touches Jesus. And now, in front of everyone, she falls before Jesus and says, "I was the one who touched you." She declared in the presence of all why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." I find this story absolutely fascinating. And as I was presenting this particular story to this large group of young gay black men who, whether we were living with HIV or not, had been impacted by the world of HIV, my message to them and my message for you now is to really examine this woman's life. This woman has been living with a stigmatized disease for 12 years. She breaks the rules to go to the only help that she knows. And I like how Jesus responds. It's not just even about healing her physical ailment. Jesus says, "Your faith has made you well." In other translations, it says it has made you whole. Go in peace. And this happens in the sight of everyone. Here, Jesus is literally snatching the stigma away that she has carried with her for 12 years. It's not just the snatching of the disease, it's the snatching of stigma. Because medical science is already like, we can tackle that. We are excited and I am so grateful that we live in a world where medical science is like, we got the disease. Churches, we need y'all to get the stigma. And Jesus is also saying that same thing in this text. Jesus is like, your faith has made you well. The physical infirmity is something worth taking care of, but you need to go in peace. And this matters not just for her, but also to those that are also watching this scenario. Because more than anything, this lady was dealing with having to be stigmatized in her society. And what we know about the research on HIV in the Black church is that when we move in a moralistic, stigma-grounded mindset, we exacerbate the problem. But when we actually address where people are, and we actually touch the humanity of where they are, and we actually address the stigma to offer them peace, that opens up so much more doors for us to actually address this epidemic. I'm going to close by reading a quote from this additional book called Preaching and Disability, where it really wrestles through a lot of the text that churches have used for years about healing. And it says, from the perspective of those who have a disability or a chronic illness, such as HIV, we see that the woman's actions may be motivated out of sheer desperation rather than faith. The author is saying it might not even be faith that's really leading her to leave her house, right? Like, faith wasn't even on her mind, it was desperation. After 12 years of constantly washing soiled clothes in the midst of weakness, poverty because she didn't have access to good health care and she had spent all she had on physicians, loss of family probably didn't want to deal with her, utter alienation from any human contact and support, sheer desperation may have been all this woman had left to impel her. Ostracized from the temple and rejected because of the ritual purity laws, her faith in God and in traditional religion had probably waned after all these years. But Jesus is unconventional in his own way and provides a new vision of human community that would be very appealing to her. Jesus meets this woman where she is. And that's honestly what we need to do about HIV. Our response needs to meet people where they are. Our response needs to be one that meets them where they are, absence of stigma, absence of shame, and absence of moralism, and grounded in medicine, grounded in community, and grounded in love. It's one where we look at people, and when we encounter people, people live with peace, not leave with shame. People leave with peace, not leave with hurt. Where the church's response is peace be with you, not rules be with you. Where we really offer people hope, not offer people hell. So Jesus and HIV is one that really takes the issue where it is and offers real solutions, not one grounded in just these legalistic moral expectations. If you enjoyed this particular analysis of HIV and the church, you will enjoy the analysis that I will have about all sorts of topics. We're going to be talking about men and masculinity. We're going to be talking about sex. We're going to be talking about OnlyFans. We're going to be talking about politics. So many other subjects. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell so you can be notified every week when we drop new content, because this is the place to be to get a progressive Christian perspective on where we are in the world and where we can go.